Thanks, guys. I know many of you do know me. Just for those who don't, my name is Gary Spain. I've a long association with senior football in the city. I'm going since I was 4 years of age, which was the end of 1970-71 season, to put that in context. And I have a huge interest in the history. My father was involved. My father's actually going since 1946 at least, because I can date that. We don't know his first game. Like myself, I can't remember my game. And my granduncle on my mother's side actually played the first season for Limerick as well. So there will be time for questions at the end. Any mistakes or anything, feel free to point them out. Any comments? It is the history. I have taken quite a bit of time to make sure it's factually correct. Obviously, some things are subjective, etc. But let's see how we go anyway. So the history, and the reason I said 1891, which I know might be a bit of a surprise to some of you, because way back in 1891, obviously the whole island was under British rule. The Black Watch, the 2nd Battalion of the Black Watch, were stationed in Limerick. And that's a Scottish regiment, by the way, from outside Perth, for those who weren't familiar. And they entered the Irish Cup, which is still the Irish Cup in Northern Ireland, but it was an all-island cup at the time. And maybe just to back up a little bit, because this was still the early days of football in this island, the FA in England was formed in 1863. The first international match was 1872, Scotland-England. The Irish Football Association, which covered the whole island at the time, was formed in 1880. And there were a couple of clubs. Bohemians were formed in 1890, Shelbourne in 1895. But in the 1891-92 Irish Cup, the Black Watch team, there was a few other army teams in the competition in those days, because the army, the players would be very fit, and they'd also be well fed, because, you know, food and money would have been tight at the time. So they entered the Irish Cup. In October 1891, they were drawn against Donaghcloney, but the trip for Donaghcloney down to Limerick was considered too much, so they withdrew. So eventually, on the 7th of November 1891, in the Markets Field, the Black Watch played a team called Linfield Rangers. Now, there is a team called Linfield, very well-known team. I'll come on to them in a second. These are actually a separate club. And from speaking to football historians in Belfast, they had no connection with Linfield, actually. They don't know a lot about them. But anyway, on the 7th of November 1891, the Black Watch were 2-0 down at half-time in the Markets Field and came back to win 5-2 in front of what was described as a good-sized crowd. It wasn't all plain sailing. Linfield Rangers put in an objection. They weren't happy with the Markets Field, but that was thrown out by the IFA. And 3 weeks later, the Lancashire Fusiliers, another army team, came to Limerick and were thrashed 8-2. So, and following on then, the semi-finals from 1891 went on to 1892. And in Belfast, the St. Colum's Court from Derry were defeated by the Black Watch in the semi-finals of the Irish Cup. So by March 1892, you had a Limerick side, albeit a Scottish Army regiment, but based in Limerick, a Limerick side playing in the Irish Cup final. And unfortunately, they were beaten 7-0 by Linfield. So the dream died fairly quickly. And but there was actually newspaper reports at the time that there was plans to have a senior club in Limerick for the following season. Now, nothing ever came of it. I can't find out any information of who was involved, what happened. The Black Watch were involved in the founding of Limerick Golf Club. There's also subsequent, in the junior game in the early part of the 1900s, the 1st Battalion of the Black Watch were involved in playing some games against Prospect. But that is pretty much all I have on the early period of senior football in the city. And again, as I said, it's quite long forgotten. Now, I'll skip forward to 1934 because, and give you a little bit of history of what happened in between, but there's very little Limerick history in that. So in 1921, and actually this was before the partition of the island, before independence, which is often forgotten, the Leinster FA, as it was then, broke away from the IFA and formed the football, what's now the FAI. It was the Football Association of the Irish Free State. And subsequently partition happened, and there were actually talks of reunification, but that's actually how it came about. And there was a league set up from Dublin because Bohemians and Shelbourne had been playing in the Irish League. Both of them actually won the Irish Cup. And actually Bohemians have a record defeat, which remains to this day, in an Irish Cup final. They were beaten 10-1. And so the Free State League was formed in 21-22. St James's Gate actually won the double. There wasn't any Limerick representative. Athlone Town came in from the provincial side, and then Fordson's had a team from Cork. And there were subsequently teams from Dundalk, as well as obviously huge Dublin representatives. Waterford came in the early 1930s. And the first talk that I can find about a Limerick team was in 1934, that the initial workings were going on to have a Limerick team in the League of Ireland playing senior football. So Waterford sent a representative, a Munster Senior League 11, to Limerick and played in Roxborough Road and defeated a Limerick selection 4-0. And then there was a game basically not involving Limerick, but it was held in the Markets Field between Bray Unknowns and a Leinster 11. Bray Unknowns actually are a team that they played in the League of Ireland from Bray up until 1943, and they subsequently merged with Bray Wanderers in the 70s, but a great name for a club. So fast forward to 1937, and there was a competition created called the Limerick Challenge Cup. I don't know whatever happened to the cup itself, but Bohemians and Shells contested that, and Shelbourne won it on corners. And then after that, and subsequent to that, there was a round table conference, and these are the names of the men who effectively brought what became Limerick FC and brought senior football into this city. So you can see them on the screen. I'm not going to read them all out, but there were subsequent meetings at the Mechanics Institute, and on the 11th of June 1937, Limerick were elected to the League of Ireland to replace a Dublin club called Dolphin. They were based in Dolphin's Barn and had been very prominent in the league for a number of years before deciding to withdraw. And Limerick Association Football and Sports Limited was formed, and meetings at 92 O'Connell Street and 17 Upper Cecil Street. And there's a photograph actually of a Limerick side from the first season. And I just want to mention something about the Markets Field as well, because the Markets Field had representatives at that stage. And one of the things where the Markets Field actually came out of, Garryowen was effectively quarries. But it's actually some very interesting, and again, not widely known information. So St. John's Cathedral was actually built from the Garryowen quarries, but specifically, according to Fleming's History of the Cathedral, it was actually built from the stone from the Markets Field. And I will clarify that by saying the cathedral itself, because the spire actually came afterwards. But if you're in the Markets Field, there's a brilliant photograph taken of Treaty United with the spire and the cathedral in the background. So the St. John's Cathedral was actually built from the stone that came out of the Markets Field quarry back in the mid-19th century. So summer football is a new thing, by the way, in the League of Ireland, as most of you know. So the seasons were run on the English season. So Limerick joined the league in 37-38. And sensationally, and it was a sensational result at the time, in the first game, Limerick went to Dublin and defeated Shamrock Rovers by 1-0, with Johnny Curran with the famous goal. A first home game didn't happen until September. That was in the Dublin City Cup, by the way. These were, in those days, the Dublin City Cup and the Shield preceded the League of Ireland. And in September 1937, then Waterford were the first visitors to the Markets Field, and they were roundly trounced 4-1, which was a brilliant start. Now, it was, I suppose, an up and down season. The Shield, maybe just to explain, at the time, it was a really important competition. It was run on a league basis of one round only. So you either played everyone home or away. And that was followed by the league itself, where you obviously played everybody twice. There were fewer teams in the league in those days, so you obviously had to fit in more matches. So Limerick finished 8th in the Shield, 10th in the league. They beat Bohemians in the FAI Cup before losing out to St James's Gate, the famous club, long forgotten now, I suppose, but of the Guinness Brewery in Dublin. And they won the cup in 1938. But in a very auspicious end to the season, Limerick actually won the Munster Cup. So in the first season in existence, won a trophy. And this was by going down to the Mardyke in Cork in March 1938 and drawing 2-2 and bringing them back to the Markets Field and actually winning the replay on Easter Sunday, 1938. And I have a photograph here of the side with the Munster Cup taken just after that win. And if I may point out a couple of persons, because the person on the very far right in the back row is Tommy Stote, who was one of the initial directors of Limerick FC, and also a granduncle of Kevin Fitzpatrick, who's actually honoured to have him here tonight, the legendary Limerick goalkeeper for 22 years. And if you'll indulge me, my own granduncle, Jim Costello, is second from the right in the front row. So he didn't play very long for Limerick, but he played at the end of 37-38 and the start of the following season before emigrating to England and passing away as a young man. Some of the things moving on to the first couple of seasons after that were a little bit of a challenge, but the first Limerick player to earn representative honours was Tommy Byrne, and he was known, and even as a young boy in the Markets Field, I heard tales of 4 goals Tommy Byrne. He was known, that was his nickname, and he played for Limerick in 41-42. He did come back again, and he had a phenomenal goal scoring record. He scored 20 league goals, 15 Shield goals, and 1 in the FAI Cup. And he achieved a feat that, to the best of my knowledge, has never been achieved in the League of Ireland before or since, that he scored 4 goals in 3 consecutive games. And it took me, that's where the nickname came from, obviously. It actually took me quite a while to figure this out, because I'd heard the tale in the 70s, but I was only able to confirm it in recent years, because the goals against Shamrock Rovers, and as Limerick put 6 past Shamrock Rovers in September 1941, were actually in the Shield. The following week, Limerick went to Dalymount Park and drew 4-4 with Bohemians. Tommy got all 4 goals. And in the league, the following week, Limerick played Bray Unknowns and hit 6 again, and Tommy got 4. So that's where the nickname 4 goals Tommy Byrne came from. And as I said, I don't think it's been done. I'm pretty certain it hasn't been done in League of Ireland football to score 4 goals in 3 consecutive games. In 1943 was the first time Limerick reached the semi-finals of the FAI Cup. And they were drawn against Drumcondra. And it turned into a 3-game epic. So there was no penalty shootouts in those days. So it was a replay and then a replay again to decide it. Unfortunately, after 3 games, Drumcondra emerged victorious and went on to play in the cup final. The following 2 seasons, Limerick actually finished runners-up in the league. And in the first of those, in 43-44, it was an epic battle right to the end. And Limerick actually finished the season a point clear at the top. But unfortunately, Shelbourne still had a game to play, and they beat Shamrock Rovers to win the title. But as Limerick kicked their last ball of 43-44 season, there was still a hope there could be champions. It was actually quite common in those days that fixtures, they were not aligned on the last day. So, and this went on well into the 70s and 80s in England as well, actually. I remember Derby County famously won the league on a beach in Spain, that they had finished their season and they were off on holidays and they needed other results to work, and they did. Unfortunately for Limerick in 43-44, they didn't work out, and Shelbourne were champions. The following year, Cork United, a very famous Great Cork United side of the 1940s, they won the league with Limerick 5 points behind in second place. So it wasn't that close. Speaking of Cork United, the first time Limerick ever wore blue shirts was in August 1943. And there's another story there, and another one I heard on the popular side in the 70s. And it's one I can't properly verify. It was certainly the one that was told, that Waterford, who had played in the league since 1930. In 1940-41 season, they were involved in a battle for the title and the FAI Cup with Cork United. They actually beat Cork United home and away, but lost in the cup final after a replay. The league, they finished level on points, and it was meant to be a playoff, but the Waterford players couldn't agree bonuses for winning the league, so they actually withdrew from. They didn't play the game. They withdrew from football and didn't come back for a few years after that. The story that's been told, and the legend is that Limerick actually bought the Waterford blue jerseys and played in blue after that from 1943 v Cork United. There is a report in the Leader in July 1943 saying that Maurice Hartree, a famous Limerick name who had actually played for Waterford in that cup final and that league run, that there was a report that Maurice was going to be signing for Limerick. He did subsequently, but not at the time. That Maurice was going to sign for Limerick to get back in the Waterford blue jersey, which is probably the closest I can get to verifying it. But it's certainly the story that was told, and the men telling the story in the 1970s would have been going to games at the time. So it's certainly something I fully believe, if I can't 100% stand over. The first Limerick player to be capped for the Republic of Ireland was Billy Hayes, the goalkeeper in 1949 who played v Belgium. And the other players to be capped for Limerick were Tim Togsey-Caneen against Norway in 1950, Sean Cusack against France in 1952, Kevin Fitzpatrick against Czechoslovakia in 1969, and Johnny Walsh against Trinidad and Tobago in 1982. Now, they all received one cap. There's one other man I haven't mentioned, is Al Finucane, who, while playing for Limerick FC, was capped 11 times and also captained Ireland. So it's quite an achievement for a League of Ireland player. Just another notable name from Limerick is Bud Ahern, Tom Bud Ahern, who actually played in that first season, and probably but for the war would have received caps with Limerick as well. He got 16 caps for Ireland and 4 for Northern Ireland, but none of those while playing with Limerick. But arguably, or probably even not arguably, the greatest footballer this city has ever produced. He went on to have a great career with Belfast Celtic, Luton Town, across the water, and he's still a name that's talked about from the history of those clubs. And just one other thing I'd like to mention, because Bud Ahern played with Johnny Gavin, another great Limerick player, and Sean Cusack against France in 1952. So the 11 that togged out in Dalymount Park against France, 3 of them were from Limerick. And I don't think that's happened before, and it might be a long time before we see 3 Limerick men lining out in a green shirt in the Aviva or wherever. So for going on in the 1940s, there were many near misses. There were no national trophies. There was semi-final heartbreak in 1947 against Cork United. A 2-legged semi-final. One leg played in the Mardyke in Cork and the other leg played in Dalymount Park in Dublin. That doesn't seem very fair to me, but anyway. Cork United won the first leg 2-1, but Limerick led 3-1 in Dalymount Park. And in some controversial circumstances, Cork United came back to draw 3-3 and actually knocked Limerick out of the cup. And it was Cork Athletic actually inflicted cup heartbreak in 1953, again beating Limerick in the semi-final. But the wait, 16 years in the league and a first national trophy that arrived in the city was the League of Ireland Shield. Now, as I said, the Shield was a one-round competition in those days. You played every team, either at home or away. And it went down to the last game of the Shield. In November 1953, Limerick travelled to Oriel Park. And there was a mass exodus from the city. There were special trains put on. Probably one of the biggest crowds that ever left. My father, as a 14-year-old, went on his own to Dundalk on the train. And Limerick needed a win to win the Shield. And in typical Limerick fashion, were 2-0 down after about 15 minutes. But one of the great comebacks, they came back to win 3-2. And that prompted wild celebrations in Oriel Park and back in Limerick. Obviously, before I was born, but a very, very special day. And one that was very fondly talked about. And it can be hard to describe now because I know some of you looking at me weren't even born when the last game in the Shield was played. But it was a really big competition in its day, and it did matter. And it was a first national trophy. And just a quirky one to throw in here, because I don't know, there's been a lot of talk about refugees and everything in the news lately. In 1956, there was an uprising in Hungary, and basically Ireland, there were a lot of the Hungarian people, they were uprising against the communist rule in the Soviet Union. I'm not going to get into any of that, but there were a number of Hungarian refugees were actually taken in by Ireland. There's another story actually that we were insisting apparently that they were Catholic, but one of the players, or one of the people that stayed out in Knocknasheen army camp was a person called Laszlo Lippo. Now, he did tell a couple of tall tales. He claimed to have been a Hungarian international, which is definitely not true, and it couldn't have been verified at the time. Then I think he claimed to be a B international, which again is not true. Jerry Farrell, a Bohemians football historian, has done a lot of research on this, and he actually reckons he played for a third division team in Hungary. But he was actually a decent footballer, and he played against Shelbourne in December 1956, and then the Hungarian FA wouldn't allow any of these players to play because they'd left left communism, whatever you want to say. I'm not going to get into the politics. So it was until the summer of 1957 before the Hungarian FA again released a list of players that were banned and weren't allowed play. And maybe because Laszlo had only been in the third division, he wasn't on the list. So Limerick were allowed to sign him. And that's why I should point out, he played under the name Janos in December 56. He played under a false name. His real name was Laszlo Lippo. So he actually played in August 57, August 57, as Laszlo Lippo. He was signed by Limerick FC, and he actually was one of the better players, as being described as, but at that stage he was working up in the Midlands, and he actually got an injury as well. So he departed the club sometime late in September 1957. And no one's quite sure what happened to him. The talk had been that he emigrated to the UK. Most of the Hungarian refugees actually had gone to the States. But there was a Laszlo Lippo that passed away in Wales in about 20 years ago, which does fit roughly around the possible date of birth, but again, it can't be verified. And one other small thing, I suppose, about what people have to say, because Harry McHugh, a great captain for Limerick and a key man involved in winning the league in 1960, he actually told a tale that when Janos, as he was then, came to Limerick, his first question was, "Where's the Methodist Church?" So maybe he wasn't exactly Catholic, but I think we can forgive him that one anyway for trying to escape. Just to explain the national trophies that Limerick have won, excluding the League and Cup. The League of Ireland Shield was won in 83-84. I would say by that stage it was a much less, it was actually revised for a couple of years. It was a much less important competition, but UCD were beaten on penalties in the last game in the Markets Field. And it actually remains the only trophy Limerick have actually won in the Markets Field, because when I go on to talk about the league wins, the other Dublin City Cup wins, the League Cup, all the wins were done on foreign soil. So the Dublin City Cup was won in 58-59. A second trophy, a highly fancied Drumcondra team were beaten 4-3 in Dublin. And the basis for that obviously helped win the league a year later. And in 1969-70, a bit of a controversial Dublin City Cup win. Limerick were drawn against Waterford, an absolute crack Waterford team at the time. They won 6 leagues in 8 seasons. They were en route to winning their 3rd league in a row. The final was scheduled for the Markets Field, and it was played in the Markets Field, and it was level at 1-1, and there was no floodlights in those days. So the game had gone to extra time, and the light was too bad, so the game couldn't be finished. So Waterford were insisting, well, we've travelled to Limerick, the replay should be on in Kilcohen Park, and Limerick were saying the game hasn't been finished. It went to the League of Ireland, the FAI at the time, and it became quite a bitter dispute in the papers, but apparently the rules of the competition weren't very clear. But in the end, Waterford got their way, and the final was played in Kilcohen Park. But Limerick promptly went down and beat the League of Ireland champions 3-2 to win the Dublin City Cup. So I'm sure Kevin's smiling. I'm sure he remembers it well. But the 3 League Cup successes. So the League Cup was kind of, it came into being in the 1970s after the Shield and the Dublin City Cup had been stopped. And a very, very young Limerick side, managed by Ewan Fenton, played Sligo Rovers in the final, a 2-legged final, won the first leg 4-0 in the Markets Field on a day that's probably best remembered for the violence and the crowd trouble. But a fantastic win. And Limerick subsequently went up the second leg and won 1-0 in the showgrounds in Sligo. I will mention Kevin saved the penalty that day. So that was a great win. And again, many of that side went on to win the league in 1980. 92-93, Noel King's Limerick played St Patrick's Athletic in the League Cup final. Another final, actually, because Limerick had the previous year in 1991 had lost to Derry City in the Brandywell. And part of the deal, because my father was actually secretary at the time, if Limerick had agreed to go to the Brandywell, and it was the first FAI final held outside of the 26 counties, that if Limerick were agreed to go to the Brandywell, they'd get to host the next time they were in the League Cup final. So Limerick went to the Brandywell, lost 2-0. I don't think too many people were expecting Limerick to get back into it too soon, because we weren't very good at the time. But in 92, Limerick were back in the final, but I think St Pat's had an agreement like that as well, so they got to host the final in Harold's Cross. But no more than the Waterford dispute over the Dublin City Cup. Limerick went to Dublin and beat St Pat's on a very memorable occasion. And in 2002 season, very much a shock result as well, and the last national trophy to come to the city, a 2-legged League Cup final against Limerick were in the second division, and drew Derry City in the final of the League Cup, having gone on a great run to get there, beating Cork City and Shamrock Rovers. They played Derry City, two-legged final, pulled off a great 2-1 win in Jackman Park, went up to the Brandywell, and it was an absolute backs-to-the-wall performance. 0-0 for about 70 minutes until Derry eventually got the breakthrough. And I actually remember being in the stand, and there was a bit of an argument whether away goals applied or not. And Noel Hanley, the Limerick secretary, was absolutely adamant they didn't. It did appear that Derry on the pitch thought they did, which is, it sounds ridiculous now, it really does, but that's actually true, because it appeared that they thought they'd won the cup, you know, that instead of going for the second goal. Noel Hanley was spot on, because the game did go to extra time and eventually to penalties, and Limerick won on penalties. We did win First Division titles in 92, 2012 and 2016, but when I do talk about national trophies, I actually mean the top tier available to all. Let's move forward to, as I said, I talked about the minor trophies. The Champions of Ireland, it's only happened on 2 occasions. The first of those was in 1959-60 season. So in 1960, 23 years after joining the League of Ireland, Limerick were champions. And it was done very much in Fortress Markets Field, because it was a 100% home record, won every game. Last home game of the season against Dundalk, Limerick went a goal down, came back. Jerry McCarthy, great centre-half, went off and played for Charlton Athletic. He scored 2 goals, sent the crowd into raptures. Other results went Limerick's way, and because it was actually it was a 5-way battle going into the last 2 weeks for the League of Ireland title. It was a very tight race, but a lot of results went Limerick's way that day, including Dundalk were actually title rivals as well. Had Dundalk won, they could have gone on and won the league. But going into the last game, away to lowly St. Pat's, Limerick only needed a draw in Dublin to win the title. Given the crowd that was coming from Limerick, St. Pat's moved the game to Dalymount Park. And there were... Oh. Sorry. 55 seconds. So the game, St. Pat's moved the game to Dalymount Park, which was allowed in those days to accommodate the huge crowd that had travelled up on the train. And 5 minutes to go, Limerick were drawing 2-2, and a very controversial goal. Many people claimed the ball had already gone out of play, but across from the wing, and basically Pats got the winner to win the game 3-2. And there was absolute devastation among the travelling support. And many of them muttering on the way back to Kingsbridge to get the train back to Limerick. Typical Limerick, we've blown it again. I don't know if anyone here tonight was there, but I know my father was there. And on the way back to going out of Dalymount Park, on the way back to what's now Euston Station, word came through that Cork Celtic had defeated Shelbourne in Cork, and Limerick were actually champions. So it was great to win the league, but actually they didn't get to really celebrate it with the fans or anything. And again, I mentioned Harry McHugh. He actually never got to see the trophy. I'll go on and talk about it another time, but he didn't get to see it as Limerick, as champions. That's the team there before the famous game against St. Pat's that actually became champions. Moving on, after winning the league in 1960, Limerick were in Europe for the first time. And also actually just before they played Young Boys of Bern, it was the draw on the Swiss champions. A first ever football match was played in Thomond Park. The Markets Field wasn't deemed suitable for the European Cup. So Limerick had rented Thomond Park off the Munster branch of the IRFU. And to familiarise themselves with Thomond Park, they played Shamrock Rovers there. And I'm pretty sure Kevin was in goal that day. But the Rovers actually won the game. Young Boys of Bern were a real crack side at the time. I think they reached the European semi-final around the time as well. And it caused a huge stir when they came to visit Limerick. They did win 5-0. In the return leg, actually, Limerick gave them quite a game, and they lost 4-2. And one of the things that's actually in dispute, but I am going to stick with these two names, the goal scorers in Byrne were Georgie Lynham and Leo O'Reilly. And the reason it's in dispute was newspaper reports, even though there actually were, the major newspapers had reporters in the stadium. But in the following day in the papers, there were other goal scorers given. But subsequently, the Limerick secretary in the Limerick Leader pointed out that definitely the goals were scored by Georgie Lynham and Leo O'Reilly. So I'm going to go with that because that's as reliable as we can get. Other games were CSK Sofia in 1965. That had to be played at Dalymount Park. And it also got postponed because of fog and was played a night later. Dick O'Connor scored Limerick's goal. Limerick played really well in that game. Were very unfortunate to lose 2-1 and went down 2-0 in Sofia in what was communist Bulgaria. And I think the whole crowd was made up of they were the army team and the whole crowd was Bulgarian soldiers. Other goal scorers, Limerick played Torino in Thomond Park in 1971, having won the FAI Cup, and were beaten 1-0 and 4-0. And moving on, we'll come on and talk about Real Madrid, but Des Kennedy scored home and away against Real Madrid in probably the most famous games that the club were ever involved in 1980. And that game in Lansdowne Road, it was certainly one that got away. Johnny Matthews had a goal disallowed for offside. Des put Limerick ahead in the second half. It really looked like a famous win was going to happen. And Real Madrid got a very dubious penalty with 17 minutes to go and then got a late winner to win the game 2-1. 2 weeks later in the Bernabeu, it was 5-1 and Des scored again to bring it back to 2-1. They were actually the only goals Real Madrid conceded until they played Inter Milan in the semi-final, and Inter managed to get one goal, and then in the final Alan Kennedy for Liverpool got the only goal for Liverpool to win the cup in 1981. The other goal scorers, Tony Morris scored away to Southampton when Limerick got a first draw, and I believe it's the only occasion in that any Irish side has gone to an English, what's now Premier League or then First Division ground and actually avoided defeat. The famous Kevin Keegan scored for Southampton. Tony Morris equalised, and it could have even been better because 4 minutes from time, Tony had a chance from about 4 yards out and unfortunately put it over the bar. So it could have been a very famous win. And that was a real crack Southampton side. They'd actually won every home game up to the Limerick game. And we'd held them to a draw. And Pat Nolan got the goal against AZ 67 Alkmaar the last time Limerick played in Europe. A 1-1 draw on the Markets Field and a 1-0 defeat in Alkmaar. So there's the team that actually played against Shamrock Rovers in Thomond Park, that subsequently most of them went on to play against Young Boys of Byrne, against CSK in 1965. That photo is actually from the CSK Museum in the stadium in Bulgaria, and that's still there. That's the Limerick pennant, which is hanging right beside the pennant from Inter Milan, because the following season in 66-67, CSK went all the way to the European Cup semi-final and were beaten by Inter, who subsequently went on to lose to Celtic, the first British team to win the European Cup. But that's the Inter pennant from 67, right beside the Limerick one from 1965. Again, some photographs from the Torino game in 71. And as I said, Real Madrid in 1980, there's Des running away celebrating the goal. That's the team from Lansdowne Road, the team from Madrid. Two magnificent occasions. It is, I suppose, I should say, a little bit controversial as well that the game was moved to Dublin. It did cause some issues in the city at the time. A lot of fans felt the game should have stayed in Limerick. I know the club had real concerns. UEFA had big fines at the time for pitch invasions, and the low wall in Thomond Park was considered not to be enough to contain the crowd. And I suppose if Johnny Matthews' goal had been disallowed in Thomond Park, it might have been a different reaction. But and certainly the celebrations for Des Kennedy, had that been scored in Thomond Park, might have caused a pitch invasion as well. But it is what it is. The Southampton game then again in 1981. And that's Tony Ward there wearing the Southampton, one of the greatest Irish rugby number 10s, fly halves of all time. Actually played for Limerick. He'd actually originally played for Shamrock Rovers in the 1970s, but obviously came down here, played rugby for Gary Owen, played for Munster, was in the team that beat the All Blacks. And Tony was an absolutely brilliant footballer, and he played on the team that played Southampton, also played in the team that won the Cup in 1982. I'll go on to talk about that. And that's the Alkmaar game from 1982, and sadly it's the last time we've had European football in this city. 41 years ago. It's long overdue, and well, hopefully maybe not too many more years, but who knows. So going back, I talked about the 1960 league win, and it did set up the 1960s. And maybe, I suppose, one of the mistakes the club made was letting players like Harry McHugh, that some very good players from Dublin, and they were let go. Ewan Fenton came in as manager, and I think the directors wanted him to build, which he was superb at, build a young side. Now, there was some great talent coming through in the city at the time. The likes of Kevin Fitzpatrick, Al Finucane coming through, Mick Doyle, Joe Mahoney. Some of the most famous names of Limerick football came through in the early 60s, developed by Ewan Fenton. But they did maybe take a dip in league form, lost in the 1963 FAI Cup semi-final to Cork Hibernians. Then Limerick had never reached an FAI Cup final. They also lost in 69, by the way, to Celtic. But in 1965, Limerick got to another semi-final, and there has been so much, I suppose, heartbreak or whatever at that stage in the FAI Cup. And in the semi-final in 1965, Limerick were up against champions, or champions-elect actually, Drumcondra. They weren't champions at the time. And hot favourites. Kevin Fitzpatrick was ill on the morning of the game. Eddie Connolly had to deputise in goal. And Limerick pulled off a sensational 1-0 win. Peter Mitchell with the only goal. And it set up a first FAI Cup final against Shamrock Rovers, the glamour team, the most famous team in Irish football, without any doubt. Rovers were already the cup holders at that stage. They'd won it in 64. They'd won the double in 64, actually. The 1965 final is probably remembered for some heartbreak. I mentioned Mick Doyle, he would have been one of the greatest players this city has produced. Unfortunately, he broke his leg in that final, and he only passed away this year, but was never the same since. Limerick really should have won that day. The reports saying we should have won. Eddie Mulvey with an equaliser, finished in a 1-1 draw, and you don't get a second chance against Rovers in the Cup. And they won the replay to Johnny Fulham goal, lost 1-0. 1966, Limerick get to the Cup final again. And who's waiting there again but Shamrock Rovers? It was also the anniversary of the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, and survivors of the Rising were actually invited to Dalymount Park and were actually paraded around the pitch on the day. There's no hard luck story this time. Rovers were the better team. They won 2-0. But another story that came out of that day was Al Finucane, the Limerick captain, was standing in the laneway in Dalymount Park, and the Shamrock Rovers captain, I think it was Ronnie Nolan, I could be wrong on that, comes out of the dressing room, kit bag under one arm, the FAI Cup under another arm, car parked in the lane, opens up the boot of the car, flings in the kit bag, flings in the FAI Cup, and drives off. They'd won it for the third year in a row. They went on to win 6 in a row. And Al was almost in tears looking at this and said, if that had been going back to Limerick, it would be very, very, very different. And it was. So just another thing to say in the 60s was the signing of Andy McAvoy. And what a player. According to my dad, I did see Andy play as a very young boy, but the greatest player that's ever played for Limerick. He was only 29 years of age. He had been the leading scorer in England. And in 64-65, joint leading with Jimmy Greaves. Jimmy Greaves is probably the greatest centre forward that's ever played football. Andy got 32 goals in 63-64. Jimmy Greaves got 35. Limerick paid $5,000 for him in 1967. He'd actually, his wife had inherited some land in Clare, and he just decided he wanted to come back to Ireland. And Andy played for Limerick, and magnificent player. The $5,000 transfer fee is the equivalent of about €100,000 today. And it was a phenomenal amount of money for a League of Ireland club to pay at the time. Obviously, he was well worth it. So there's just some images from the 60s Cup finals. That's the team from 65 and 66. And the invitation to the 1916 survivors. 1971, and unfortunately I have no memory of this myself, but it is probably the greatest day in Limerick's footballing history. And I've spoken to many people, and I appreciate we did win 2 league titles, but winning the cup in 71, and because of all the heartbreak I talked about in the 60s, I must mention Ewan Fenton again, because he left in 1967 to manage Linfield in Belfast, won every trophy, but the troubles in 1970 had really come to a head, and things were pretty bad up there. And I know Ewan said that actually the coffee shop he used to go every morning to have a coffee and a pastry was actually blown up. And he had a very young family at the time, and he just decided he was getting out of Belfast. Came back to Limerick, having won the Irish Cup in 1970 with Linfield. Led Limerick to the 1971 final. Came up against Drogheda United, so there was always going to be a first-time winner in the final. If I must say, Drogheda did a little bit of the heavy lifting, because they went to Milltown and put 5 past Shamrock Rovers, and then beat Cork Hibs in the semi-final, and both of them actually played off for the title that year. But final, Limerick and Drogheda. Again, I'm going to mention the controversy. In the first day, it finished scoreless, but Tony Meany won the cup, supposedly with a late diving header that many of you will know Charlie O'Leary, the most famous as Jack Charlton's kitman and still 99 years young today. But Charlie decided to put up his offside flag, and he wasn't very popular in Limerick for a long time afterwards. And he did admit that he was very popular with the FAI, and maybe it's another code, but anyway, it's... So the late Tony Meany maybe have got the credit for winning the FAI Cup for Limerick, but no matter, because the following Wednesday, Hughie Hamilton with 2 and Davy Barrett got the goals, and Limerick thrashed Drogheda 3-0. And I will mention a great save by Kevin Fitzpatrick as well when the game was at 0-0 that could have been absolutely crucial. As I already mentioned, the 1970 Dublin City Cup win at Kilcohen Park, the 75 League Cup win, and again, cup final heartbreak in 1977. First cup final I actually ever attended was against Dundalk. A great run to the final in that year. First round of the cup, Sligo Rovers were the dominant team, went on to win the league that season. Limerick were drawn away to Sligo on the showgrounds, and probably the worst draw they could have got. And in a sensational result, went up and won 4-1 in the showgrounds. Next round drew Waterford at home, a tight draw in the Markets Field. Again, went down to Kilcohen Park, and Dave Kirby got the only goal. And I think Kevin saved a penalty that day as well, I could be wrong. But We won 1-0, again, a bit of a shock win. Semi-final against Drogheda, and Drogheda really must have been cursing Limerick at this stage. But it took 3 games and a few periods of extra time and a bit of a lucky win, a bit of a fluke goal to beat them 2-1 to get to the final against Dundalk. Unfortunately, in fact, Limerick actually played very well. Dundalk scored early. Limerick played really well, had many chances to equalise, but a late Terry Flanagan, his second goal, won the cup for Dundalk. And that was it really for the 70s. There's the 71 team. That's Ewan Fenton there going out with Al Finucane and Ronnie Whelan, the father of Ronnie Whelan Sr. actually was a very famous Irish international and player as well, but maybe his son, Ronnie Whelan, is better known these days. That's the team before the 71 Cup final, and again in the dressing room with the cup. And the team with the Dublin City Cup back in the Markets Field. And this is a crowd of supporters. I don't know if anyone recognises the fans mixed in with the players before the 77 Cup final in Dublin. So there might be a couple in the room in there. So just to talk too about some of the glamour friendlies and some of the English opposition that have come here. The earliest I can find is Everton coming here in 1948. And we did take a few hammerings. I'm not going to mention too many results. But in 1951, Leeds United were defeated 3-2, which was a pretty sensational result at the time. Fulham came in 1954. The famous names such as Bobby Robson and Jimmy Hill played in the Markets Field. Celtic, some of the great Celtic teams of this 1960, 1970 again, 71. Liverpool came in 62, managed by Bill Shankly. Stoke City came, Leicester City, the likes of Gordon Banks, Stanley Matthews played in the Markets Field. Manchester United and even the Oman national team. Not to mind the likes of Tottenham, Chelsea, Sunderland and Man City, who all didn't play at the Markets Field but played the likes of Thomond Park, etc. And moving on to some of the foreign tours that Limerick have gone on. Again, some of these can end up getting forgotten. In 1951, to give the economy a boost after World War II, the UK government held what was called the Festival of Britain. And all the 92 Football League clubs were given funding to host a series of friendly games, which included all the League of Ireland clubs going over and playing the 3rd Division North sides. So Limerick played at the end of 50-51 season, went to the northeast of England and played Darlington, Gateshead and Hartlepool. I will say the results were probably not very good. A 5-0 defeat and 2 4-1 defeats. There were some tales that maybe at the end of the season the players hadn't been as focused on playing football and might have had a drink or two too many, and the focus might not have been on the games. They weren't considered that important at the time. In 1969, Limerick embarked on an incredible tour of Europe. Belgium, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, including the 75th anniversary game. It took. I mean, most of it was overland. Maybe Kevin can give the talk on this because he probably knows a lot more about it than me. But we did play in the 75th anniversary game for a famous Swiss club, Shaw Fond, who are still a very prominent club in the Swiss League. 1973, Limerick went to Portugal and only lost 1-0 to Porto, and played teams including Vitória FC from Setúbal. Again, some very famous names, and a 1-0 defeat in Porto. It didn't actually go down well. I believe it was quite a physical game in Portugal. But anyway, in 2013 and 2014, Limerick went to Scotland and then to the Basque Country, played games against the likes of Dundee United reserves, Hibernian reserves, and Atletico Bilbao B and SD Amorebieta in Spain, whether the Basque Country. I better be careful on that one. Some of the famous North v South games that happened as well. So there were a number of north-south competitions. The first of those was actually, I did go on and talk about the FAI breaking away and everything, and in the 20s, the relations were not too bad. There was a lot of talk about the FAI and the IFA getting back together again. By 1930, relations had been really, really bad, and there were no games between clubs, between the intra-league teams for much of the 1930s. In 1937, they started up again. But relations had got a bit better in the 40s, and there was this Dublin and Belfast Intercity Cup competition that ran from 1942 to 1949. And Limerick qualified for the first time for it in 1945 and were drawn against the famous Belfast club Glentoran. And it was called the Dublin and Belfast Intercity Cup, and the games were actually played in Dublin and Belfast, apart from, I think, one game was played in Dundalk. But Limerick played Glentoran in Dalymount Park and, played them first in the Oval and lost 2-1. The return game was played 2 days later in Dalymount Park, and Limerick actually won 2-1. There was no, well, they were level. They would have been level on away goals. There was no away goals. There was no penalty shootouts. There was no extra time. Games in those days were decided on corner kicks. So over the 2 games, Limerick had earned 12 corners and Glentoran had earned 8. So Limerick actually qualified for the next round, where unfortunately they were well beaten by Distillery. And another addition from that game that I'm still trying to find the full facts, but there was a very famous Northern Ireland IFA administrator called Toby Mercer, who had played for Ireland in the late 1890s, early 1900s. And he was an administrator, very famous chairman of Glentoran. Glentoran Distillery still play for the Toby Mercer Cup. But Limerick made him an honorary vice president in the Oval that day. And I'm still trying to find the Limerick connection, but there is a Limerick connection of some kind. And he was also a very revered guy in the League of Ireland at the time, because his portrait was actually hanging in the FAI offices, which would have been unusual given the relationship. So I suspect he was one of the men that healed the breach between the IFA and the FAI at the time. I don't know the Limerick connection, but he was made an honorary vice president of Limerick, and probably the first and maybe the only man to hold office with clubs on both sides of the border at the same time. But again, I can't actually find the Limerick connection. Limerick were back in the Intercity Cup in 1948 and defeated Derry City but lost to Belfast Celtic. And in 1949 they were beaten by Derry City. Some famous games in the Blacksnake Cup, a couple of trips to Coleraine in the Blacksnake Cup, which was quite a journey in those days, and there was quite big Limerick crowds. And in particular, a Texaco Cup tie against Derry City in 1970. I think Tony Meany got the only goal in the Markets Field. And despite the troubles in Derry at the time, a huge Limerick crowd made the trip to the Brandywell. There's other stories that I certainly couldn't tell on tape. But anyway, that's for another day. But Limerick took an early lead in the Brandywell, but unfortunately lost 4-2, and Derry went on. They actually went on to play Shamrock Rovers and earned a glamour tie against Wolves in that competition. The Tyler Cup, Limerick played, that's actually the Limerick team that played Linfield at Windsor Park in 1979. That was actually the first game of the 79-80 league winning season, the first competitive game. Led 1-0, went down narrowly 2-1. Portadown came to Limerick in the Tyler Cup a year later and defeated Limerick. So 1980, and probably the most successful era in Limerick's football history, and the arrival of Owen Hand in the summer of 1979 was certainly the catalyst for that. I think one of the key things he did was the players were significantly fitter and very focused, and in a 30-game season, Limerick pipped Dundalk by a point. And it's a season I remember very fondly. I was 13, 14, and was at every game bar Sligo away. And it was nip and tuck. There were some memorable games. I could pick out a 2-0 win over Dundalk in the Markets Field with a couple of late goals. 2-0 down in Ballybuffet, and Limerick came back and won 3-2. A defeat by Dundalk, and I think that for me the crucial day was Limerick were down in Kilcohen Park against Waterford, Al Finucane's Waterford. Al Finucane had actually scored a late equaliser in the Markets Field to deny Limerick a win. And Limerick led 3-1 in the second half. Waterford came back to 3-3. It was a brilliant Waterford team at the time. Tony Morris scored a stunning winner for Limerick 10 minutes from time, and the referee disallowed the goal to give Limerick a free in. And there was bedlam. And the calmest player in the place was Owen Hand, who calmly put down the free and stuck it in the same top corner that Tony had put the ball in. Limerick won 4-3, and I say the day was crucial because Dundalk were at home-to-home farm at the same time, and they only managed to score the draw, which was an incredible shock result, and that actually extended Limerick's lead. Unfortunately, Waterford beat us in the FAI Cup semi-final after replaying an epic game. And I mentioned 1944 when Limerick lost the league, having finished all their games. Well, Dundalk had actually finished all their games in 1980, but Limerick still had a back match to play in Athlone. And basically, Limerick needed a point to win the league. Athlone were third place in the league at the time. They were pretty formidable opponents. And it wasn't one of the best performances, perhaps one of the worst performances of the season. Athlone took a first half lead for a free kick. Battled back in the second half, 20 minutes from time. Jerry Duggan was taken down in the box. It was a definite penalty, no doubt. And Tony Meany, who remains, the late Tony Meany, the best man I ever saw to take a penalty. And he calmly sent Mick Smith the wrong way. And a few late flurries, but Limerick held on for a 1-1 draw and were champions of Ireland for the second time and the last time. And I will mention something else about that day because I mentioned Harry McHugh in the 1960 team. He was one of the key influences there. Harry's son, Harry McHugh Jr., actually played for Athlone that day. Actually, his centre-half partner was Johnny Fulham, who played against us and got the winner in the Cup in the 60s with Rovers. One of the greats of Irish football, playing his last ever game of football. But Harry Sr. was actually there, and even though his own son was playing in Athlone, he said he wanted to see Limerick win the league. And he finally got to see the league trophy in Limerick hands 20 years after he had been instrumental in winning it for the first time. So some of the other things, in 1982, sorry, okay, keep. 5 minutes, yeah, okay. I'm not too far away. 1982, the last time either of the two major trophies came to Limerick was the FAI Cup. I mentioned Tony Ward earlier. He took the corner that Brendan Storan finished the net against Bohemians in a neutral Dalymount Park. And but in fairness, all the cup finals were held in those days. And again, a great day in the rain in Dublin. 1983, there was, I don't want to get too much into this, but Limerick FC ended up in the High Court in a dispute over the ownership of the club between Pat Grace and John McNamara. John McNamara initially won the case, and there was a Limerick team. When I say a Limerick team, there weren't any Limerick men on the team that went and played Bohemians in Dalymount and lost 9-0. Very controversial circumstances. The names that many of you would be familiar with in Limerick were picketing the Markets Field a week later. Limerick were due to play Waterford. The Waterford bus arrived, and the players who were playing from Limerick, I think most of them had come down from the north. The players, Waterford actually refused to pass the picket. The game obviously couldn't happen. It was a surreal situation. I mean, there were a lot of fans. I was standing outside watching it, watching the players we adored. I particularly remember Joe Mahoney standing there. And Waterford, to their credit and to huge cheers from Limerick, and they were bitter rivals at the time for many years, but to huge cheers from the Limerick fans, Waterford refused to pass the picket. Anyway, it went back to court. Pat Grace subsequently won the case. There's a lot of stuff that went on afterwards that maybe, but certainly that was considered at the time to be the welcome decision for Limerick football. We did leave the Markets Field at the end of the 83-84 season. As I said, won the Shield on the last day. The colour change to yellow and green did not go down well. They were pack races, racing colours actually. There has been a strong attachment to blue and white. The Rathban era, I think, is very much a case of what might have been. There was a lot of money coming into football, and the Grace family did invest a lot of money in football in the 80s. There's no doubt about that. 1985, Limerick got to an FAI Cup semi-final against Galway. Shamrock Rovers had already won on the Friday night. Limerick were in Europe if they could beat Galway, expected to beat Galway quite comfortably. 2-0 up in the second half, and Galway scored twice to come back and earn a draw at Talca. The replay in Athlone, a freak goal in extra time, and Galway won. Galway qualified for Europe for the first time. Rovers won the cup easily enough, but we haven't been in Europe since. 1989, Limerick finished third in the league. We're right in contention now. Derry City, it was a great Derry team, went on to win the treble, but even up to February 1989, we're in contention for the league. Derry came to Rathban and absolutely blew Limerick away. A huge crowd there that day. Mentioned for Tommy Gaynor, he was the leading goal scorer in the League of Ireland. The first player since Tommy Byrne in 1942 to top the goal scoring charts. So Tommy Gaynor did it in 84-85 and 85-86, and Billy Hamilton in 88-89. Billy became the first man to score 20 league goals since Tommy Byrne did it in 1942. The greatest Limerick striker, well, Des Kennedy's 104 league goals for Limerick. There's nobody with even half that total. So I think that argument can be done there. Des also, give him his credit, got 9 for Galway and 4 for Newcastle West, but the Limerick ones are 104. Johnny Walsh has actually made the most appearances for Limerick all time with 465 appearances. Great clubman Johnny. As I mentioned, he was capped in 1982 against Trinidad and Tobago. There's some of the images from the 1980s, the league-winning team, the FAI Cup, and some from Rathban. 1990s, we probably entered a poor time in Limerick football after that. Got relegated in 1991, as I said, lost the League Cup final to Derry City. Sam Allardyce came in the summer of 1991, and well, he has been a top manager in England. This was his first managerial appointment, and he did an incredible job. It was a very young Limerick side, got a couple of experienced players like Kevin Power up from Waterford, Albert Finnan, etc. Had a really good side, won the first division, went back up as champions, and Sam left to go back to England. There was absolutely no money in the club at the time. It really was. It was on a wing and a prayer. I must mention actually Father Joe Young, who did a lot to, I don't think he was very much of a football man, but he was a huge, fantastic priest, fantastic work for the community in South Hill. And he kept football alive in the early 90s in Rathban. Noel King came in as manager in 1992-93. Brief period, won the League Cup, as I said, qualified for the top 6. Bit of a rivalry with St. Pat's at the time. Fortunately, in 94, there was relegation again, lost the cup semi-final to Sligo. And it was pretty much the wilderness years after that. Limerick stayed in the first division right up until 2012. Did win a League Cup in the second tier in 2002. Had some playoff heartbreak against UCD and Derry City, but but finished, I think, 4 times bottom of the first tier or first division, so the second tier in Irish football, for some all-time lows for Limerick football at the time. I will mention the 2010 game against Barcelona. Well, that should have been against Barcelona. Again, I have to be careful with exactly what I say, but what had been announced was that Limerick FC had obtained a glamour friendly against Barcelona, which would have involved Messi playing in Thomond Park. For, I don't know, and again I have to be very careful for what reasons were given, but the FAI did not allow permission for the game to take place. And there was a lot of angst. Former chairman Pat O'Sullivan was, let's say, very angry. I think he took the FAI to the High Court subsequently, but it didn't actually get to court. There was an agreement out of that. But again, it was very controversial at the time. The game didn't happen. I do believe Limerick would have lost money on the thing, but I think, in fairness to Pat, he had a lot of money at the time and he didn't care. It would have been a huge boost for the city had Barcelona come to Limerick in the summer of 2010. They actually ended up playing Vålerenga of Norway instead on the same night that was going to happen. Messi did come to Dublin about 10 days later and opened the Aviva, playing for Argentina against the Republic of Ireland. But Limerick, unfortunately, didn't get to see him. 2012 went back up as champions. 2013 and 14, Limerick played in Thomond Park. Well, I think, in fairness to say, it's a fantastic, magnificent venue, brilliant stadium, but far too big for League of Ireland football as it is at the moment. Back to the Markets Field in 2015, which was a very emotional and historic occasion for a lot of people. First time since 1984. It is the spiritual home of Limerick football. There's been football played, as I said, there since 1891 at least, and possibly earlier. And so that was a special time. Unfortunately, relegation, heartbreak, back up as champions in 2016. And got relegated again in 2018 to having in 2020, for the first time since 1937, there was no senior football in the city, which was a major blow. And apart from Dundalk, we had the longest unbroken run of senior football for any provincial town or city in the country. We did have a women's team in the Women's National League as Treaty United in 2020, a new Phoenix club, which is obviously there today. So Treaty United was founded in 2020 with a women's team in the league, and in 2021 came back as a men's team as well. So thankfully we do have senior football back in the city. Treaty took the original colours from 1937 of red and white stripes with an away kit of blue. So that's probably it, unless, well, any questions or anything? Or that's fantastic. Okay.